Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Business Brew. I'm your host, Bill Brewster. This episode is brought to you by Koyfin. Koyfin displays financial information simply and elegantly. Koyfin is one of the fastest growing platforms for financial data and analytics to research stocks and understand market trends. I discovered them thanks to their very passionate user base, many of which are my friends. I hope that all of you are using it by now. If you do use it, then you no longer need to just imagine a Bloomberg light with tons of high quality fundamental data, a powerful graph engine that can show it all clearly, and a user interface that is super slick and doesn't look like it was built in the 1990s. Instead of imagining it, now you're dreaming about it. It's that slick. If you're an individual investor, research analyst, portfolio manager, or financial advisor who hasn't checked Koyfin out, go do it right now. You're not going to regret it. Sign up for free at koyfin.com. That's KOYFIN.com. This episode features Margot Edelman. She is the general manager of Edelman's Bay Area hub, where she leads a team of practitioners and innovators in Edelman's San Francisco and Sacramento offices. Edelman delivers industry-leading communication strategies that build brand trust and visibility. They are a award-winning global public relations consultancy firm. I really enjoyed speaking to Margot. A lot of our conversation centers around Edelman's Trust Barometer, which they release annually. I found the conclusions of the Trust Barometer to be very, very interesting, and am going to drop a link to the Trust Barometer in the show notes. I would highly encourage everybody to take a look at the Trust Barometer before they listen to this episode so that they can have some sense of what Margot and I are talking about. Don't think any disclaimers are needed for this show. As always, though, do your own due diligence, and I hope you all enjoy this one. So, Margot, how you doing today?
I'm good. How are you? Excited to
I am very
be
well.
chatting.
Yeah, as I told you before we were on the air, I chatted with our mutual friend Oren Falkowitz, friend of the pod, one of the early guests. So that made my day a little bit better. I'm always happy to chat with him. So he recommended that we talk, and he was very, very excited that we were recording this. Do you mind giving people a little bit of a background on yourself and what you do, how you came into it, whatnot, and we'll take the conversation from there?
I'm happy to. I lead the office for Edelman, which is the world's largest PR firm out in the Bay Area. I've been out in the Bay for over 6 years now. And it's no coincidence that my last name is the same as the name of the company. My grandfather started the business actually in the early 1950s. My dad runs it, so I'm actually the third generation in the company. And at this point, lead a team of nearly 200 out in San Francisco, focused mainly on technology companies. But we also sort of work with healthcare companies, financial services, et cetera. And very excited to be here to talk a little bit about what it's like to work in a family business, a little bit about communications, and then also a little bit about sort of Edelman's signature piece of IP called the Trust Barometer, and sort of why we do it and the impact on sort of communications and the industry at large that it's had.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time. I can't imagine that it's easy to carve out time after running teams that large, and I thank you for stopping by.
Yeah, the key thing is to have good people working with you. So you're kind of okay, everything's taken care of, because you can rely on people with you to help make sure everything's going fine.
I think what you do is really, really interesting. I found you, Oren obviously talked about the trust index. You mind talking about some of the origins of that, when it started, and kind of what you all were thinking when you came up with it? And whatnot?
Yeah, sure. It started in the early 2000s. I think we've actually been doing it for over 20 years now. So it started when I was still in school at that point, and sort of not yet working in the business. But I think the reason it started was because actually my father, who started it, Richard, sort of noticed that there were sort of four key institutions that seemed to be sort of the most important in terms of the landscape of sort of influence in the communications world. And that was media, government, business, and NGOs. And so he basically was like, we should actually look at trust among these four key institutions, and actually study this not just in the US, but in key markets around the world to understand what is the level of trust in these four key institutions. And then sort of got results that year. Then the really interesting thing is we just kept doing it over time. And so what it ends up being is sort of longitudinal data that really shows sort of what's going on in the state of the world in that moment. So for example, if you look at 2008, 2009, during the financial crisis, obviously there is a massive drop in trust in business, and in particular, drop in trust in the financial services sector specifically. No surprise, again, because of, what was going on in the world, which is, you have Lehman Brothers failing, you have bailout of the large banks by government. So, what's seen in the data is very much a reflection of what's going on in the world. Just this past year, what was interesting is that there was actually a rise in trust in government actually coinciding with the pandemic, although it's now since fallen a bit. Just because really government sort of stepped in and played a key role in making sure that people still had jobs, people had food, that, the world kept going despite COVID. And then also, if you look more at sort of, in trust in different industries, trust in the tech sector actually fell significantly, which is also interesting, sort of showing the reckoning around tech, and people's trust in the industry sort of plummeting in recent years as well. So again, the data really reflects sort of what's going on in the world, and looking at it in aggregate over 20 years is a very interesting sort of reflection of the rise and fall in different, these four key different institutions.
Yeah, it's striking how much trust there has been in tech traditionally. Tech has really benefited from a lot of trust, which is not what my perception would be based on the headlines and who's getting called into Congress. But as you noted, the trust is declining a little bit, right?
Yes, exactly. And I think the key thing is what? The key thing is tech has gone from having sort of this halo around it. It's, the iPhone that, allows me to order my Uber, that allows me to order my food. It's my computer. It's like all these things that make my life better, to tech as sort of something that's maybe a little bit more scary. Like Facebook now, has all of my data. Google knows all of my search history. My phone knows where I go. So it's gone from, something that helps me in my day-to-day, that's something that people are a little bit more worried about in terms of privacy and security. And nowhere is that more, I think, obvious than in social media. I think trust in social media was in like the mid-30s. It was extremely low. So trust in social media, which I know is different than tech, but I think it's a reflection of sort of the mistrust in certain parts of the technology industry.
Yeah. And I mean, I was shocked to see trust in search engines in the mid 50s.
I agree with you. I think it's a little bit of people just don't necessarily, I don't know, there's just generally don't necessarily believe what they read in the media. And I think search is part of that.
It's just odd because if I don't trust something that I read in the media, I go directly to
Search.
Google.
Yeah, true.
So
Totally.
it's like, if we're getting to a point where people don't trust what they're searching for, then what in the world? I mean, how do you even find information? And I'm friends with a man named Jim O'Shaughnessy, and he's got this theory that we're sort of approaching the Shannon's limit of like there's just so much information that our brains sort of can't even handle it, and figuring out where to turn for the information that you can trust is certainly something to ponder. I think it's interesting that it appears as though people seem to be turning to their employer based on the previous study that you did in 2020, right?
Yeah, it's true.
Seeking.
People trust information from their employer. The employer has sort of become the new source of news and the truth for people, which is extremely interesting and at once an opportunity for business and for companies, and at the same time, I think a little scary, the fact that people are not trusting sort of outside sources. They're going to to their employer instead. Something else that's interesting is sort of the Democrat-Republican divide. The Democrats do trust the media and Republicans don't. Or people who are Trump voters don't trust the media and, Biden voters do. So a lot of this is also falling along political lines as well.
Yeah.
Perhaps not surprisingly.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, I think that was going on for a while. The election, it seems like, sort of exploded the partisan divide among the trust, who trusts what, right? It seems like that was a really big event.
I don't know if the election made it explode. I think this has been something that's been going for a while, and maybe it was just sort of brought further out by the election. But you can definitely see sort of people who trust media, liberal; people who don't, generally conservative.
Yeah, I do think that neither, and when I say sides, I'm just gonna, for lack of a better term, say CNN and Fox and reduce it a little bit to television. Neither side did a very good job remaining down the middle during the Trump years. And I sort of wonder how much of the distrust in media is driven by like a profit incentive of the media companies to drive clicks, and more generally, as the dissemination of information and attention expands and explodes into different sort of sources of information, what incentives that creates to create clicks is something that I spend a fair amount of my time as someone that runs a podcast and would probably be better off having like super bearish guests on, for instance. They're really good for ratings.
Yeah, totally. It's like,
and I kind of wonder how that all intertwines.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. People now are sort of speaking in extremes as a way to get clicks and as a way to get people to, watch their show, read their content. So you're totally right. And I think if you look at the news media, I mean, it's becoming more that way too. Like if you read the editorial sections of the New York Times, it's become, incredibly liberal. And I think maybe 10 years ago, it wasn't quite as sort of extreme in that way. So I think this is affecting not just sort of the, more fringe commentators, but also sort of publications that are a mainstay of the news today.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's not unfair to say that, like, on, whether it's AOC, whether it's Trump, whatever, the notion of saying things that are maybe somewhat inflammatory as a strategy has been something that I think politicians have embraced. And maybe it's because I'm paying more attention, or maybe not, I don't know, but it's been interesting to watch, and I can understand why a natural progression towards less trust would be the outcome of that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I do think, the election of Biden versus Trump was maybe a vote towards the middle, but at least in terms of news and in terms of sort of Congress, it doesn't necessarily seem like that's, yes, there's Biden, but then there's also so much extremism on the other sides.
So when people are turning to their employer as a source of information, whether it's, it seems to be big, meaningful information, right? Like thoughts on vaccines or whatever. Like how has the CEO's role changed in today's world, and what do brands or businesses need to think about from a messaging standpoint, both internally and externally, to help, facilitate trust, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Well, first, actually, what's interesting is that the CEO is actually not the most trusted spokesperson for a business. So the most trusted spokesperson is actually a technical expert, which is interesting. So as you're thinking about, as a company's thinking about who should be speaking about it, of course, the CEO needs to be out in front and speaking, but you also need to have sort of a chorus of voices, including, regular employees, people like myself, a technical expert. All of those folks are sort of highly trusted spokespeople versus the CEO. And then what's interesting is for the CEO, they're no longer expected just to be able to only talk about the results and the business of the business. It's much more, they're expected to have a point of view on societal issues. And they're expected to have a point of view on climate change, on, basically DEI in the workforce. It's a much broader license to not have a point of view, and also to sort of lead the business in a specific way. So maybe, Benioff obviously is on one end of the spectrum on that. And, you can see that with him sort of saying, if you are a Salesforce employee and you live in Texas, we'll move you out of Texas, given the most sort of recent, ruling on abortion, for example. And I know he's sort of maybe an extreme, but it seems like, at least in the data, that, more and more CEOs have the license to operate that way and to have a point of view and to sort of move their business in a way that's more focused on sort of the business's role in society versus just sort of producing numbers every quarter.
Yeah, well, we saw that a little bit with the stakeholder capitalism movement last year. I don't know how much of that is signaling to politicians that maybe they realize the inequality gap has gotten a tad too wide, and maybe labor needs to participate a little bit more, the communities need to participate more, or whether or not it's like truly like a first principles move towards stakeholder capitalism. I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah, fair. Fair. I'm not sure either. And it seems like some of this is actually being led by the employees themselves. And employees themselves are actually demanding that their company have a point of view, their company do something. So I don't think it's just sort of coming from politicians. I think it's coming from the workforce.
How much of this, I guess I have two thoughts. One is it's got to be a really complicated needle to thread when, almost by definition, if a organization is truly diverse and has truly diverse thought, it's not going to be more than 60-40 liberal conservative internally, right? So to then impute the need for a CEO to have views it's a big ask on a CEO. So, like, as a communications advisor, how do you think about that to the CEO? And I guess the real question is, do you say like it's more important to lay out sort of how you think about the world and how you think about the corporation interacting with the world as opposed to the conclusions that you come to? Like, what should people think about from a messaging standpoint to be effective in communicating whatever they're being asked to communicate?
Listen, I think the most important thing is to be authentic, both to the CEO and to the company. So where a CEO is going to have the most level of authenticity is where he or she sort of feels comfortable engaging. And so I think some CEOs, are like Mark Benioff and they feel comfortable engaging on a whole range of topics. And some CEOs really just feel comfortable sort of engaging on earnings or what's the product roadmap. And I think you're advising CEOs along that spectrum. And so I think you need to sort of meet the person where they are and maybe nudge them a little further if they're not the type that really wants to speak out. Could they have a single issue that they sort of take on? Maybe it's something around the environment and climate change, for example, which is a huge topic right now. But something where they'd feel comfortable versus expecting them to sort of speak out on every single issue out there. And I actually do think for the CEOs that want to speak out on every single issue, in a lot of ways, it's actually better to have a little bit of like here are the 3 ones that we think are important for you. And here are the 3 ones that you consistently need to speak about. Because if you talk about everything, you're sort of, it seems a little bit too diffuse and almost like the message gets lost. So I'd say, engage CEOs where they are and either move them a little bit forward on one issue, or if they want to talk about everything, sort of get them to focus on, 3 core things that are important. And then in terms of the company, I think it's important for a company, if they're going to sort of focus on an issue or a cause, to have it relate back to their business. So for example, for technology companies like a Microsoft, a Google, we work with Infosys, for example, on this. A big thing they've done is around job retraining. Because a lot of their technology, could potentially displace workers, or like the workforce that they have is not necessarily right for the products that they're creating now. So it would be about retraining their own workforce and then actually partnering with, with schools or with companies like a Coursera to help, train up students and sort of people who are looking for, second careers in how to do that and spending money there. So I would say like that's actually a very authentic thing for technology companies to own, is sort of job reskilling, for example, both for their own workforce and then for, American students and people looking to sort of get other jobs.
Yeah, that makes sense because I noticed in the report that one of the key sources of mistrust is at least or distrust in or declining trust in tech is probably the most appropriate way to say it is the fear that
Job loss.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it's job loss. No, it's a huge thing, and that's something where I do think tech companies can absolutely play a big role, and it's absolutely credible for them to do that.
Yeah. And I mean, how much how much conversation because I think that part of the problem is the perception that companies are coming to displace people's jobs. And to be fair, I mean, a lot of jobs may be displaced. How much of the conversation that you have is about messaging out to the world, no, that's not what we're trying to accomplish, or what are some of the hurdles of getting that message out? Because I do think if the conversation is being had a lot internally, the externally it's not resonating in a way, and I think the reason that I can sort of hang my hat on that is it shows up in the data that you're showing that
Yep.
trust is declining, right? So how do you think about getting that message out as a communications professional?
That's a good question. I think first of all, it's just even being able to have the conversation with the company that they need to even recognize that this is an issue. Because I think sometimes in the Valley, there's so much excitement and interest in the new and in what's disruptive and what's changing the world, making things more efficient. It's being able to have a conversation of like, hey, when you take a step back, your product is actually going to displace all of these truck drivers or Uber drivers or delivery people. It's displacing sort of people who need sort of the gig economy for wages, or even a bigger issue like people like truck drivers who make a decent living every year and they're going to be potentially be displaced by autonomous trucks. Like, it's having those conversations of saying, hey, you actually need to think about the implications of your product for real people, and what's actually going to happen. What is going to be the repercussions when your product debuts? It's not just efficiencies; it's also sort of changing people's lives. So I think even just getting recognition that that is something we need to look at and talk about is the first step. Just because I don't necessarily think those are always the conversations happening immediately in the Valley around these type of products. It's much more about like the excitement and the efficiency and the sort of step forward. And then secondly, I would say it's not just about messaging, it's also about actions. So going back to our discussion around sort of companies, investing significant amount of capital and retraining their own workers, and then, partnering with educational institutions to help retrain Americans for the jobs of tomorrow. That's sort of putting your money where your mouth is. So it's not just saying, oh, don't worry, our products are good. It's,
Yeah.
really, it's basically taking an action to make sure that happens. So I think it's about pairing messaging, yeah, of course, but then also around what a company is actually doing. That's the most important thing.
Yeah, it seems to me that the difficult thing to watch is somebody that's not in the Valley, and I say this as somebody who has a very fortunate position in life, anyway. But so I don't know that I have standing to say this, but I think I do. Is it's hard to see the valuations of some of these companies explode and see how much money is being created for the founders and the shareholders, and then at the same time, the blue collar America appears to be hollowed out a little bit, and it's like what are we doing to take care of the fabric of society, for lack of a better term? And I think it's interesting to open up your study and see that it appears to me that the distrust or the declining level of trust is not just the United States. It appears as though there are many countries, most of which are developed,
Yeah, it's developed
that are
like
going
Western
through
Europe.
this. Yeah. So I mean, it's not shocking given what we've seen with populism in general, but it's an interesting conundrum that we find ourselves in.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think, you know, the latest of that is sort of what's going on with the crypto industry, where you have some people who've made literally billions of dollars in crypto, and I think now the government's sort of looking there and being like, oh wow, what's going on? We need to step in and regulate. But I think that's an interesting area. That's sort of the next sort of frontier potentially around regulation and what does it mean for sort of what was before, what's to come, and what's the role of government in regulating it, basically.
Yeah, it's a conversation that comes up in my life a fair amount where like for instance, I have one friend that's really into NFTs.
Yeah.
And I think that there is a reasonable amount of crypto speculation and NFT speculation that is of the mindset of like, you know what, this is all just pretend anyway. So why do I have any faith in fiat currency, some pretend government idea versus a computer idea? And I have more faith in math and computers than I do in governments. And it's hard for me to not see a connection between the explosion of crypto and the continued level of declining trust in institutions.
Yeah, no, you're completely right. That's completely true, and I think in particular for Bitcoin, that makes a lot of sense. But yeah, I totally agree with you, and but it really very interesting to see what happens, just because it seems like it was pretty unregulated. Now it seems like the SEC is sort of seriously cracking down, and it should be interesting to see. And same thing with SPACs, like they're obviously sort of potentially cracking down on SPACs, so it should be interesting to see where the regulation ends up.
Yeah. And then, and then the other side of it is with all the explosion in options trading and whatnot, I think that there's a perception among at least a percentage of the population that's like, you know what, I might as well just bet this on options and leverage because the stock market's rigged anyway. So what are we doing? And I the thing that's hard for me to separate is how prevalent this thought is versus how new it is. Like, I don't know how prevalent it is. It feels very prevalent to me, largely in part because of social media. And then also, how new is it, or do the ideas just sort of spread quicker? And I find myself thinking about this a fair amount. I have not come up with a good answer.
Question. And I also wonder like how much of it was just people being home during the pandemic and like literally having more time to like trade on Robinhood,
Yeah.
and that's an interesting question too, of like how much of this was like produced by people not being able to socialize. So you're like, oh, I'm going to interact with people online, which includes, trading stocks on Robinhood or whatever other platform.
Yeah. Yeah. When you say like trust in tech is so broad.
It's true.
How do you like categorize that in your own head? Like, is this the survey is done
tech,
amongst?
so I think we allow people
Yeah.
to sort of define it on their own. But that's a really good question. And social media is broken out as something different. But when we say tech, it means everything from, technology around Amazon delivery to, your iPhone to your computer. I don't think most people think about like databases and things like that, but it also
Yeah.
includes that. You only think about it if you work in my industry and promote these kind of things. But I think we allow people to sort of take the phrase as they want, with the idea that I think that's telling is how people would interpret it.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't help but think that social media has an outsized role to play on the respondents, and I only say that because maybe it's my own head, and that's a sampling bias. But I find it interesting that trust in tech somewhat declined over the last year when we were all locked inside, and the whole reason that we were able to exist is how good tech is.
You're totally right.
Enabling today's life.
Totally, you're totally right. It would have been a completely different year if this had happened like 25 years ago. I do think it's that combination, like you brought up, of job loss or fear of job loss and displacement. I think that's huge. And then I think also, fears around privacy and security. That's another sort of big issue with technology companies. So I think it's a combination of those couple things that I think have exacerbated sort of the fear of tech and the drop in trust in technology, for sure.
An interesting debate that is starting to fester, at least in my community, and I say that as like in the investor community, is the amount of money that Apple makes on their app store.
Yeah.
And the perception among, I think, most of my friends as consumers, how much they love Apple. And then like, so, I mean, I have, I'm working with Twitter on this idea called a super follow. Um, People pay for me to produce extra content for them, right? And I noticed yesterday, uh, if people are listening, don't super follow me yet. I don't have enough tools to really give you something. I'll tell you when I do, if I ever do. But I'm working with Twitter to help them. I love Twitter, so
Yeah, cool.
I'm helping them. But like Apple takes 30% of
Yeah.
everything that I get.
Well, I've been
right?
following sort of the Apple Epic fight,
Yeah.
which is interesting. I mean, listen, I think it's good to have a company challenge them. I would, listen, we don't work with Apple. They obviously produce incredible products. They truly do, and products that have changed, basically the lives of, millions and millions of consumers. But I do think it's good that, companies are challenging them. That's why we live in the US, and that's why we have sort of a judicial system that allows that. And, ultimately, could be a potential check on what could be a monopoly.
So when, a company, I mean, let's just talk about Apple theoretically. Well, it's Apple. It's not theoretical. But, if there is a crack in the trust, how carefully do you have to watch that as a brand? Because it seems like so much, well, I think it doesn't seem, I think it's actually true that so much brand value is sort of this amorphous like feeling of trust and
Totally.
what this brand represents, that once trust is lost, it's got to be very, very hard to get back.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And I think that was true of a lot of companies, for example, in the financial services sector, which, all happened during the financial crisis back in 2008. And it's taken them over a decade to rebuild anywhere where they were before. I think in terms of Apple, I mean, I think it would be really interesting I don't have data on it, but I think it would be really interesting to see the data on it. And for a company like Apple to actually track trust over time, I think would be like, and also by market would be incredibly interesting. Just because I'm sure, just given how prevalent Apple is, they would be able to get a very good read on where they stand. Listen, I think what we're actually trying to do at Edelman is actually, first of all, understand what the drivers of trust are. What actually makes people trust a brand? And I think it's, things around like trust them to do the right thing. It would be, that they care about the environment that they're working in. Like we have sort of these core trust drivers that we've identified. And then we're also looking eventually to link trust to an outcome. So for example, are companies that are more trusted, do they have a better stock price? Are people more likely to purchase? So we don't have these metrics yet, but we're in the process of sort of trying to figure out, trust is great and it's always good to be trusted, but then what is the outcome when you have trust and what is the outcome when you don't have trust and what's the gap? Because ultimately I think that's what companies care about is, yeah, trust is nice, but what does it mean for my bottom line? What does it mean for my stock price?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I can't think that trust would not drive bottom line. And like one of the companies that I'm thinking about is like Dollar General. If I drive sometimes to go see my father. If I'm driving, he lives in Appalachia. If I'm driving on that, like the road, if I see a Dollar General sign, I'm like, okay, that's a brand I trust. I know that I can get an experience I can count on. I can get what I need in there. It's not the sexiest example, right? Like people aren't like, oh yeah, Dollar General, but they're really very good at what they do. And the idea that doesn't result in higher throughput for their stores and more repeat customers would be very. I bet they would be high on the trust index.
Yeah.
Do you do anything like? Do you do consulting with? I know tech is a real world company, but sort of like more brick and mortar type companies.
Yeah, absolutely. Edelman works with a lot of brick and mortar companies. Some of our biggest clients are companies like a Unilever, for example,
cool.
which, definitely makes tangible products. We work with a number of drug companies. Like we worked with J&J, we've worked with AstraZeneca, we work with Genentech. And then we work with Starbucks. That's, definitely a brick and mortar company. I feel like in some ways it's similar to what you're describing with Dollar General, where if I see a Starbucks, no matter where I am, I'm like, okay, I know I can go in there, get a latte, get like a sandwich and I'll be good. So same thing.
That's got to be super fun to consult on those companies.
It is, and where I think we can sort of uniquely sort of add value, or where we've come in is, being able to tell more of an innovation story for some of these more legacy brands. So
Hmm.
that's fun too. Like for example, we did a little bit of work with like positioning the Starbucks CTO, for example. So helping tell the story around how Starbucks is actually a tech company.
Yeah.
Because every company now is
Well,
a
you
tech
did a good
company.
job. The investors really like that story. I'll tell you
Exactly,
that.
exactly. I think that's part of the interest for a lot of these companies is looking at a Wall Street audience and saying, okay, how can we look and sort of get the valuations that tech has? And in a lot of ways, it's true, right? Every company has an app. Every company, has an online presence. So it's really different than 15 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. Domino's is another one that comes to mind that like their app is a really um, integral part of their offering and also a very important way that Wall Street views them, right? Is like, this is the way of the future. It's on your phone. It's a seamless experience. It gets to you quick. You can trust what you're getting. Like, I think the innovative part is a non inconsequential.
Totally. And I think something else we end up getting asked a lot along those lines are help when comms for recruiting for tech talent. Because every
Hmm.
company now wants to have engineers and, has a CTO and wants to recruit around that. So we get a lot of asks around, okay, how to help us position ourselves favorably for, recruiting technology talent.
Yeah, I would think that's a very very tough. That would be a competitive field, right? Because you've got all the biggest money in the world that can just shower candidates. So if you're not one of those, I mean, for the example that I brought up, if you're Twitter, like how do you recruit versus Facebook? It's almost got to be the way
Versus
that I,
Domino's, right? Because Domino's is
yeah,
trying to hire tech talent too. So it's
yeah.
all a little bit of a competition. Agree on, yeah, there's Twitter versus Facebook, but then there's also versus, the companies that, need a technology strategy despite being brick and mortar.
Like financial services companies, for
That
example.
absolutely, that's true too, and that's a whole other sort of interesting area because there's so many requirements around data and making sure that the data is secure and who they work with around that. So probably same with government contracts as well. So that's
Yeah.
another interesting sort of area. Um, it's also
When
interesting.
I
Like
saw,
a lot of our tech clients actually work with financial services companies, and they have these great case studies, and then we unfortunately are unable to sort of go to market with them because
hmm,
it's always
it's
tough to
like
get.
regulated or whatever.
Yeah, it's always tough to get sort of companies to want to talk about what they're doing. Or customers to want to talk. Same with a lot of industries. Actually, it's tough to get sort of customers to go on the record sometimes.
Why do you think that is?
That's a really good question. I think a lot of times people just want to make sure that make it seem like things are happening seamlessly. They don't necessarily want to be, famous for relying on XYZ technology vendor to help them with their transformation.
Yeah. That seems a little silly to me.
Yeah, I don't
I mean,
know.
I'm not trying. Yeah, I'm not trying to put you in a tough spot. I guess my comment is, I think that we're entering a world where if you're hiding from, I think everything is coming in the open.
That's true.
So I think embracing that strategy and leaning into it and saying, yeah, you know what? We don't have this core competence in our company. So we've outsourced it to this great vendor and look at how good we are at picking the right vendor and look at the outcome. I think
Hey,
that's like a
I'm with
much,
you. I'm totally with
yeah.
you. You sound like me. Yeah, so
Because I mean, it's everybody knows everybody's not a jack of all trades anymore. I don't
true.
think that you can hide from that.
It's true. I completely agree. I think being open and transparent and communication is good. And we, counsel our clients that exact thing. So
Yeah. Well, I think you're right for what it's worth, but
I'll
I'm
take
just a
it. Thank
guy
you,
with a
Bill.
podcast. So, what was it like to walk into this global consulting firm and communications firm? You're pretty green out of college, right?
Pretty green out of college. That's definitely true. Well, out of college, what was good is I got to work in a couple, interesting places. I actually worked in Shanghai for a little bit. I worked in London, so that was a lot of fun. I got to see the world a little bit, much more than I had just growing up in New York. Um, where I would say sort of I got my sort of real sort of training and sort of real boots on the ground. Where first I actually at a business school worked on our data and insights team, really learning, okay, how do you make communications more grounded in data? I worked for a guy who'd been a pollster for Mike Bloomberg, for Hillary Clinton. So that was very much sort of just, what's the right word? You know, jumping right in, getting a lot of training. If you made a mistake, just keep going, fix it yourself. So I got a lot of, hands-on training in terms of sort of data and analytics for comms. And then I actually moved out to the Valley when I was 27. And that was sort of some more sort of definite, what's the right word? Very hands-on training in terms of, I managed to win a couple clients, mostly people who were my friends who were like, hey, Margot, like, you're smart. Like, we want to use Edelman. Like, why don't you do our comms? Like, we'll hire you. So doing that a little bit and really learning on the job, and learning a little bit through sometimes through doing things that were great, and sometimes through making mistakes and being like, oh shit, well, I guess I'll never do that again. And then sort of just keep going. And, I think the interesting thing about the Valley is it's a very network-based place. So once you have a couple clients and you do good work for them, you then, more people start hearing about what you're doing. Their investors will hear about what you're doing. They'll read a good article about the company and they'll be like, hey, can I talk to your PR person? Or, hey, like, I saw the work you guys were doing here. That looks really interesting. Maybe you can do it for us. So it starts to build sort of a little bit of a flywheel where it starts to build from there, and you get a little bit more of a reputation. And then from there, getting new clients gets a little easier. So it really all is about, I think, sort of doing good work and having sort of the right clients in the beginning. And from there, it becomes a lot easier to grow a business.
When you say that people will read about what you did, how important are things like trade journals and local papers anymore? I mean,
read about what we did. I mean, they look at, my client in, Business Insider or whatever and be like, oh, you got that piece? That's cool.
So the answer is not very important.
The trade, trade
or
publications.
Potentially.
Listen, I think they are important. Like, for example, there was an article in PR Week actually, now over a year ago, that talked about how Edelman, didn't have a chance in the Valley and only boutiques were good. And I was reading it and I was like, the PR Week team quoted somebody who worked for Edelman 6 years ago. Like, they don't know about our current roster of clients. We actually have a great roster of clients that are sort of innovative, interesting, disruptive companies. And these guys are sort of, to me, like, had gotten it wrong. And so, that to me was important because it's what everybody in the industry reads. So to read that, like, an outdated view of Edelman, I was like, this is stupid. The guy should have called me. But also I should have known him and like have been able to give him a different perspective versus having him rely on somebody who worked at the company 6 years before. So, I think it is important to know because there's always sort of chat and, talk in that world. And I think it's important to know the people who are writing about it. Otherwise you'll get misrepresented in these publications. So not good.
So how long did it take? I mean, you walk into a family business. How is that dynamic?
That's a good question. I think ultimately people just want to know that you can do a good job and that you can help them and that you have their best interest at heart. And so, it's maybe takes a little bit longer to make people feel comfortable that that's who you are. But I think once that's established, that level, going back to trust, that level of trust, and that level of understanding that you're there to help, you're competent, you can add value to their business, I think it can be a really great thing. It just maybe takes a little while to get there.
Yeah, I would think so. I personally would think that like having the same name in the beginning would be a little bit of a burden because I think that the perception is like, well, you were given this, right? And
yeah, it's true. And I would say where I ended up benefiting, I mean, first of all, in an external setting, it's really helpful. So people will take meetings with you. People will, give you a little bit of time when they wouldn't necessarily give somebody else at the company. And listen, at the end of the day, a lot of the PR business is about access. So I think from that perspective, it's very helpful from an external perspective. And then if you show up, you can't be an idiot, right? Like you have to, show up, be smart. Like people will give you a conversation and then from there, it's sort of up to you to convert into something real. And then I would also say something that, I ended up doing was really trying to win my own clients. Just because in that way, I didn't have to sort of say, oh, hey, account lead, please bring me to see your client. Please trust me. It was kind of like, okay, this is my client and it's my team and, hopefully we'll do a good job. But at the end of the day, it's sort of my butt on the line. So I think just having my own base of clients was really important too, and clients that that trusted me, that hired me, and then built a team around that.
So how was it when your dad thought that things should go some way and you thought things should go another?
That's a great question. I would say, given that I was out in the Bay Area, I was the one ultimately who was the decision maker, which was a good thing. But we've definitely had discussions that way. We're having that discussion now around return to office, where he's very insistent that we need to be back in the office 3 days a week. I'm like, the team's fine remote. So, and I think part of that is a geographic thing where on the East Coast, everyone's really sort of gung ho about going back in. And especially on the West Coast, it seems people are a little bit more comfortable, I think, with remote work.
How do you deal with with remote work and keeping like a team together? It's something that I've thought a lot about, but like there is something about being at the office where spontaneous conversations can happen.
Yeah, that's true.
And you're in like a creative industry, right? So I would think that like how do you foster creativity and bouncing ideas off each other even though you're not?
That's a great question, and I do think there's a huge amount of value to being together. You're absolutely right, and I think no matter what happens in terms of like you know remote work versus being in the office, I think ideally the team would be in the office together. At least a couple times a month.
Yeah.
In order to foster that, I think right now, just given where we are in the pandemic, I think it seems like it's premature to ask everybody to go back in, just for where we are right now. But I agree with you. I think you do lose something by not being together. In terms of sort of keeping team cohesion, what I'm trying to do is just ensure knowledge sharing. So, for example, we do an all hands once every 2 weeks for an hour where we have different teams sort of showcase the great work that they've done, debut new offerings. So really making sure that people are connected. They see sort of great work being done. They feel connected to the office as a whole. So I try to have those, which I think help. This sounds sort of cheesy, but we've put in like a mentorship program where we're ensuring that people, are connected to a mentor who, they meet with at least once a month and can ideally help sort of facilitate being on, new pieces of business that are interesting, have conversations with them about their career outside of just their direct boss. So trying to at least, maybe it's in a little bit of a forced way, but encourage those connections that would happen, I think, maybe more naturally if we were all in the office together.
Yeah.
We've also created a book club. Again, just like
Oh
trying to
yeah.
do things that are like, fun and, again, keep sort of the social aspect of it up.
Yeah, I don't think that sounds cheesy at all because in an office setting, like you said, I was assigned to a team, right? So that's not much different than a mentorship program. It's just we all sat in a pod together and over the internet, it would maybe be rather than sort of a spontaneous conversation, it's more scheduled. So maybe in that way, it feels a little bit more forced. But I think I have thought that training younger people would be very difficult in a remote world. I would think the mid-level people and higher sort of can do their own thing remotely, but training up younger people, I think, would
Yeah,
be
and I agree. That's I think where
difficult.
we're missing out by not being in the office is people. There's some people who are on my team who've like literally never been in an office if they graduated this
Yeah,
past year. So it's a different thing I think when you know how to be in an office and you know what that feels like versus when you've never been.
yeah. Hmm. It's an interesting thing to ponder, like the idea of whether or not we're gonna sort of stay in a remote world. The longer it goes on, the higher the probability that this is just the future and it's what everything looks like. And it seems like things are running okay, but not falling through the cracks would be
I would
tough.
also say from like a client perspective, it really does help to see people in person just because you end up having conversations about opportunities or things that are needed that you might not necessarily get if you're just sort of going and talking to somebody virtually. Just because there is that sort of informal aspect to it. And like you said, like you can come up with ideas. The conversation can lead in different ways versus when you're sort of just having a virtual conversation, it's a little bit more just set and cut and dry around, I need this. Okay, you can deliver this. Great.
What would a traditional like I hire you, I'm a company and I need some help. Like
Yeah.
you're in the Valley, the other office is in New York. How do you make sure that the message gets out to everyone, right? Because those are two thought, I don't want to say bubbles, but that's the
No,
word
you're
that's
absolutely
in my
right.
head.
Those are two bubbles. Listen, we actually have offices all throughout the middle of the country. So we have a large office in Chicago. We have offices throughout Texas, office in Atlanta. So we are not just a coastal firm. We absolutely work throughout the country, and I think that that's a big benefit. Like part of the reason we've actually gotten hired by some tech companies in the Valley is because we could help them understand how do you communicate to buyers that sit in the middle of the country
Yeah.
for their products. So people that run manufacturing companies, for example, or automotive industry, how do you communicate to them? How do I reach them? So rather than saying, hey, we just want to go with a Valley boutique, they're like, oh, great. The fact that Edelman has, reach in this area, which other firms don't, is actually a huge plus.
Yeah, I
So
would think it would
that's
be.
that's a big part of our value proposition is that we have offices all throughout the U.S. and we understand how most of the U.S. works, not just the Valley or not just New York.
Yeah, I would think that would be. And then I would think the other thing that you benefit from is with a firm of your size, um, you can you can pour more resources into market research, right?
Totally,
And
yeah.
like,
We can afford to do the trust barometer, right?
yeah,
Like that's a big piece of IP that comes out every year, and it's a big investment from the firm, and I think it's a huge benefit to the industry that we can do that. I think it benefits, of course, Edelman and our clients, but I think it benefits the industry as a whole to sort of up level the conversation around why comms is important, and we're lucky to be in a place where we can make that investment.
so in a world where media is so sort of like distributed and bifurcated or whatever the right word is, where do you see communications going in the future?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think we're approaching this in a couple ways. First, it's just to know how media is being distributed. So it's understanding that reporters are now on Substack, or
Yeah.
they're using LinkedIn. They're using sort of different modes of communication, and they're really becoming their own media brands versus sort of relying on the head media brand of CNBC or the New York Times, et cetera. They're now creating their own sort of media brands using these different sort of technology tools to get their story out. So I think that's one. Two, I think it's the rise of influencers. I know this is something that's happened now for quite some time, but in some ways, influencers are a lot like the press in the sense that you need to build a relationship. They'll have a very distinct point of view. They have a set following. And so I think it's understanding how to incorporate influencers into the conversation. It can't just be going to sort of traditional press anymore. It's about sort of understanding who are those influencers and how do we speak to them and sort of incentivize them or encourage them to talk about our brand or the company that we're helping to promote. So that's another thing. And then I think it's about owned content for companies. So using
Hmm.
their own platform as a media channel. So if you look at tech, for example, Andreessen Horowitz has basically launched their own media publication. They
Yeah.
literally have an editor, and then they're also using their own channels like Clubhouse, for example, to have regular programming with the portfolio company CEOs. So they really are starting to sort of own getting their own message out there through the different channels that they have created. So I think that's another aspect of sort of comms. So it's definitely a dynamic and changing market, but I think the fact that newsrooms are shrinking doesn't mean that comms is getting smaller. It just means it's getting more complicated, and there are more places where we need to be looking to sort of tell our clients' message.
It's interesting watching Andreessen Horowitz with Clubhouse because they started to host like nighttime chats, right, with senior management in Andreessen Horowitz, which I don't think had as much access to the public without Clubhouse. And then it was interesting to see their strategy of driving traffic to that platform, and I could see how having the ability to aggregate attention and distribute your own content would be like a huge benefit going forward in the future. How do you think about with Substack and influencers generally? There's no editorial process, right? So how do you think about the risk that somebody just sort of goes rogue who, you've sort of like tied your brand or message to, for lack of
Listen,
a
that's
better
a great
term?
question. And I think it's a little bit like there's the new rules of the road. So I think, first of all, again, it's about trust. It's about having a relationship. Do you trust the reporter that's on Substack? Is it somebody that respects embargoes? Is it somebody that, you know, have a relationship with and know that you can trust them. So I think that that's a big part of it. But you're absolutely right. It's a very different thing than the old traditional process of, the reporter sort of, has the editor. You can always call the editor if you feel like you need a correction. Like that doesn't exist anymore. So I think you even more so need to have an established relationship with the person that you're working with and have a level of trust in them, and they in you, that you're telling them the right thing.
Yeah. I mean, what do you see for what does Edelman become in the future? In this world, it's competing is interesting. It's ever shifting. What's your responsibility on behalf of your clients, on behalf of you as a leader in the company? How do you see all that?
It's a great question. I think in terms of sort of our presence in the Valley and in San Francisco, I want to make sure we continue to work with innovative and interesting companies, and that we continue to work with disruptors. Just because I think it's important for us to be sort of at the forefront of different industries and helping those companies communicate about what they're doing. So that's something that I personally just want to continue to do, and also sort of pushing the envelope in terms of how we do it. So not just saying, okay, let's go to the whatever traditional reporter at the Journal, which is obviously great, but also thinking more broadly around who we go to and how we tell the story from just a tactical lens. And then for the company as a whole, I mean, I think in the next few years, we're really looking to shift out of just sort of being a US, UK company to being much more global. And, we do have offices throughout Asia, for example, but I think continuing to grow our presence there is really important, just because we're sort of still undersized for the market. And then something else we're focused on is, for example, continuing to grow work we're doing with, financial communications, helping companies with IPOs, things like that. And then on the public affairs side, advisory work there, sort of continuing to grow that business as well. So I think we're both trying to sort of continue to expand and deepen our geographic footprint, and then also continue to expand sort of the capabilities that we offer as well.
How much of your time as a firm is let me ask you this way. Do communication firms like break down into you focus on politics, you focus on business, you focus on NGOs or whatever? Your trust index spans all of those entities. So I guess some of my question is like, how do you think about where certain interests bump up against each other? And do you focus on, like, do you have siloed teams that focus on
Yeah,
different industries?
that's a great question. We don't work for politicians, so we don't do that aspect. I know some other firms do, but we don't. Like, we wouldn't be hired by, the Biden administration or AOC, for example, to help them on their campaign. So that's not something that we do. And then in terms of how we divide up, it's less about who we're going to. Like, are we going to go speak to an NGO? Or are we going to go speak to somebody in the media? And it's more about by sector. So like we'll work for companies in the financial services sector, we'll work for companies in tech sector, health sector. So we sort of divide it up that way. And then also sort of functionally by what we do for them. So are we helping promote their products, or are we helping sort of promote the company as a whole from a reputation standpoint? So it's a little bit
Yeah.
also more like functionally, what are we doing? Because there are different specialties based on that.
Yeah, that makes sense. The financial services, the increase in trust, I think is interesting. Off 2009, I understand it was like at a super low base, but how much of do you have a sense of how much of the increase in trust is due to some of these fintech companies and the interpretation of empowering the user again
That's a great question.
versus
I don't know the answer to that. I think that'd be something really interesting to explore. I don't know, but that's a really interesting question, a really interesting take on it, is how much of it is sort of larger financial services institutions having made amends and feeling like, they're putting the consumer first, or things like Goldman Sachs, like, launching a fund for, black owned businesses or women owned businesses, versus how much is companies like, a Robinhood, that do put sort of, finance in the hands of consumers. I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's a really interesting question.
Yeah. Because I just kind of wonder, it's interesting as somebody that came from a bank, I look at it and I think, well, banks have a really important role to play in society in that they lend and they provide a lot of the capital that is required for supply chains to exist. On the other hand, people hate them.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, I look at some of the innovation in fintech and I say, well, this is sort of gimmicky. But on the other hand, like people really do seem to enjoy the experience
I also
of
think they're
many of
basic
these
things like
apps.
no overdraft fees that like probably do go a long way in terms of making consumers feel like those companies are on their side, things like that. I don't know.
Yeah. So the elimination of something like trading fees has been replaced by payment for order flow.
Yeah, totally. I mean, and I think that has its own can of worms there, which is not necessarily
Yeah.
good for the consumer either. So, but it's just more hidden. So
Yeah,
I
well,
agree with
it's
you.
it's an interesting communications thing, right? It's like, oh, you don't have to pay for things. Well, I mean, you're paying for things, but you don't have to pay for things, right? But
Listen, there's
it's a
no such thing as
messaging
free
thing.
lunch. And
Yeah.
listen, I do think from a communication standpoint, the best thing is to always be transparent because all this stuff comes out eventually, and it's better to tell it in the way you want to tell it with examples that you want to use to illustrate why it's either good for the consumer, what you're doing to put the consumer at the heart of what you're doing, versus allowing, somebody, an investigative journalist, disgruntled employee, whatever it is, to come out with their own message around it, and that's the tone that ends up getting set.
Yeah, I like that way that you said that. I think that that's definitely right, and I would say that one thing that helps companies with communications, in my view, is transparent letters to shareholders, um, owning up to problems, and being really honest about this is how we fixed it, this is what we did. I think that goes a long way when people can start to trust management, and then they can start to say, okay, well, if nothing else, I know that these people aren't hiding things from me.
Yeah.
And then I've seen it work the other way where people are like, I don't know that I can trust these people. And then even when they try to do the right thing, it sort of doesn't resonate.
Yeah. No. I agree. So I think the more companies can sort of own their own narrative around it and be transparent, I think the better. They're better off in the
Yeah.
long run.
All right, cool. I do appreciate you stopping by very much. And I hope it was enjoyable for you. And I hope that when you listen, you say, I'm glad that I did that from a communication standpoint.
Sounds good. It was also just fun to chat and hang out.
Yes, indeed.
All right. Sounds good.
All right, have a good one.
Nice to
And
meet you.
thanks again.
Talk to you later.
But it's absolute